Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem, Little Boy Lost, Frank Raymond Deford, 1944. Andrew Kley, 48, was up early getting the field ready to plow the garden at his home near Cedar Hill, Missouri. It was Monday morning, May 29, 1944, on what promised to be a hot day. Temperatures were already hovering in the mid-70s, and it wasn't even 6 a.m. Andrew climbed on the tractor while his foster son, 13-year-old Frank, cleared the debris from the area. Frank shouted above the noise of the tractor, "Pop, I'm going back to the house to help Mom clean the chicken coop now." Andrew nodded his approval. The boy was a handful, but he could be quite helpful at times. He watched the lad as he headed toward the house, then turned his attention back to the field. Around 6:30 in the evening, Andrew parked the machine and walked to the house. He stopped at the door to scrape the mud from his boots. Gertrude would not be happy if he tracked mud into the house. Suddenly he heard the bang of a shotgun and instantly felt a stinging sensation. Confused and frightened, he desperately scanned the grounds where he spied the astounding image of Frank casually walking toward him, holding his 12-gauge shotgun. Andrew begged the boy not to shoot again, but Frank lifted the barrel and aimed. Realizing the child was not going to be deterred, Andrew stumbled away seeking a place to hide. He saw the rain barrel and ran behind it. As he did, he caught a glimpse of Gertrude, splayed on the ground beside the chicken coop, blood seeping from her left side. "Please, Frank," the man begged. "I'll give you the keys to the truck. Just don't shoot anymore." Nevertheless, his pleas fell on deaf ears. In one last attempt to save his life, Andrew leaped at the boy, knocking the gun from his hands. Frank turned and ran as Andrew crumpled behind the rain barrel. Welcome to the true crime podcast, Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem. I am your host, Mindy Hudson. This podcast brings you historical stories of murders and scandals that occurred in small towns throughout America. By combining the resources and methods used in genealogy research, I pieced together the details of the lives and circumstances of notorious events that touched the lives of our ancestors. The aim of this podcast is to examine the background, documents, newspaper accounts, and cultural influences surrounding the events. It is not my purpose to sensationalize or shame the subjects or their families. All families have skeletons in the closet. But to look at the lives of real people and see how circumstances of nature and nurture, as well as how world events affected the lives of the people involved in the stories. I have spent over 50 years interested in genealogy research and recently retired as head of genealogy at the Jefferson County Library in Missouri. During my tenure, I began a podcast entitled Murder and Mayhem in Jefferson County, Missouri, which gained popularity. Upon my retirement, I decided to continue and expand the podcast with similar stories found in small towns across the United States. Join me now as we explore tales of old-fashioned murder and mayhem. Frank Raymond Deford, sometimes called Frank Beck, never had a chance. He was born in Los Angeles, California on February 20th, 1931, to Mabel May Anderson and Lawrence Deford. Mabel's father, Roy Anderson, was a tree surgeon from Galesburg, Knox County, Illinois. From the few records found that may be linked to Lawrence Deford, he also worked as a tree trimmer, which may be how Mabel and Lawrence met. Mabel was not a, quote, one-man woman, end quote, according to an interview with her granddaughter Sheila Cruz. She had been married briefly to a truck driver by the name of Jerry O'Hara, with whom she had a son named Darrell. Although the three were found living together in the 1930 Knox County, Illinois census, both Jerry and Darrell seem to have disappeared by 1931, when Frank was born. No marriage license has been found between Lawrence Deford and Mabel Anderson O'Hara, but a California birth certificate indicates that Frank was given the surname Deford. By the 1940 census, Mabel was living in St. Louis, Missouri, on Gano Avenue, listed as the wife of John Beck. She had 2 more children in addition to Frank, whose surname is listed as Beck: Mary Ann Beck and Arthur Beck. This marriage also fell apart quickly. It was during these tumultuous years that Frank's life took an ominous turn. Both Arthur Beck and Frank Deford later recounted how the children were abused and left mostly unsupervised and generally starving. At the age of 11, Frank met up with other delinquent boys who were members of the 12th Street Gang, an offshoot of the more dangerous adult gangs, which included Egan's Rats and the Cuckoos. According to his half-brother Arthur, Frank began his criminal career by stealing food for them, but soon got into petty thefts and violent fights. Frank's account of his life, as told to a jury and recorded in the News-Democrat on September 28, 1944, revealed the astonishing underbelly of the inner city. Beginning of article. He opened the eyes of his listeners by revealing the workings of various gangs, made up of boys ranging in ages of from 11 to 17 years of age. He said the Termite Gang, operating on Cass Avenue and consisting of about 200 boys, is the toughest of them all. Others, he mentioned, were the 12th Street Gang and the Dirty Dozen, the latter operating in North St. Louis. He said that each gang has a boss, and they have their own clubhouses, which are vacant sheds, completely furnished, and that regular meetings are held where crimes are planned. He admitted that sometimes those committing the crimes were required to divide with the gang, but most of the time they kept what they got. Among other crimes mentioned, he told how they would slip into theaters and crawl under the seats and pick the purses of women that were hanging below the seats. End of article. Longing for the approval and affection he lacked at home, Frank reveled in the tough boy antics of his chosen group, the 12th Street Gang. Small for his age, with sandy brown hair and a boyish, freckled face, being identified with the street gang gave him some measure of protection. He was initiated into the gang by cutting a V-shape into the base of his right forefinger with a knife. Afterward, he burned the V into the back of his hand with a match. Despite his success at petty thievery, Frank admitted the police caught him several times and warned him about the path he was taking. Of course, the advice fell on deaf ears. As soon as Mabel and John Beck separated for good, she went to work as a waitress, leaving the children completely without supervision. It didn't take too much time before the children were removed from the home by the St. Louis Children's Aid Society due to neglect. About 1943, Arthur was sent to Bell Fountain Farms Institute for Boys in St. Ferdinand Township, St. Louis. Mary Ann Beck was first sent to an unknown foster home. However, she married Robert Mutsu by 1950, according to the census. She was 15. He was 30. In July 1943, Frank, 12, was sent to Cedar Hill in Jefferson County, Missouri, to the home of Andrew and Gertrude Kley. The Kley family consisted of Andrew, born 1896 to John F. Kley, and Bertha Nolte. He married Gertrude Butchmiller in DeSoto, Missouri in 1917. They had 2 sons, Lester and Leo. Both boys had married by 1940. It was not uncommon for rural families to take in orphans and foster children to help with the farm labor. Frank's job was to help plow, milk the cow, and carry water to the house. By his own admission, life was very comfortable in the Kley house. Pop Kley never whipped Frank, even though he was expelled from Hillsborough School for fighting and causing trouble. Nevertheless, Pop Kley tried to give Frank as much of the experiences of a normal childhood as possible. He even allowed him to use his 12-gauge shotgun to go squirrel hunting, a decision he'd come to regret. Although Frank's foster parents were good to him, they required that he rise at 4 a.m. to begin his daily chores, and Mom Kley often scolded him for not doing the chores correctly. Worse, she sometimes made disparaging remarks about his natural mother. This was the one thing the boy could not tolerate. On Christmas Eve, Frank ran away from the house and ended up back at John Beck's residence on Rutgers Street. Beck was not the boy's father and felt no responsibility toward him. He brought him to Mabel's house, and she took him back to Cedar Hill. The Kleys were an active and respected family in the community. They were members of the Mutual Benefit Society, an organization in which members met together to share information and ideas about improvements in farm methods and equipment. The January 1944 meeting was even held in the home of Mr. and Mrs. Kley. Sadly, Andrew's father, John F. Kley, passed away at the end of January 1944. Perhaps this event contributed to what occurred next. During the following weeks, Frank Deford began asking his foster parents, whom he called Mom and Pop, if he could go back to see his mother for his birthday. Knowing the unhealthy situation of his family life, they refused. Not accustomed to being denied the freedom to do whatever he pleased, Frank began to simmer with anger toward the Kleys. He later admitted this was when the idea to kill them first entered his mind. Biding his time, Frank continued to enjoy the benefits of a stable family and comfortable home life, something he had never experienced before. He had his own room to sleep in and plenty of food. The situation took a turn in the spring. One source claimed that Pop Kley got a tip that the boy was planning a series of robberies and confronted him over the rumor, which sealed the boy's determination to murder them. On the morning of May 29th, Monday, Frank rose early and went out to help Pop with the plowing. When he was finished with that chore, he said he was going back to the house to help Mom clean the chicken coop. His confession was published in the Jefferson County Record June 1st, 1944. Quote, he said he went to the second floor of the house, got the Kley's double-barreled shotgun, and obtained 5 shells. I went out and waited for Mom to come out of the chicken house, but she didn't come, he told officers. After a while, I crept up behind a hog pen and waited there. Mom came out and I aimed, but I couldn't get her in my sights. When she went back in, I sneaked up to the window with the gun ready. She was reaching up and I aimed for her left side for the heart and shot. She fell and didn't move at first. Then she wiggled a little and gasped. Convinced the mom was dead, the boy went into the house, changed his clothes, found $1.35, and took 3 jars of jam, 2 loaves of bread, and a sack of tobacco, and put them in a truck. I knew Pop had the keys, so I started out to the field to shoot him off the tractor to get them, the boy continued. But Pop had pulled up under the shade, so I slipped back to the house. I saw it was almost 6 o'clock, so I decided to wait for him to come in to milk. With great attention to detail, the youngster told how he hid about 25 yards from the back door, with both barrels of the gun loaded and with 2 more shells on the ground beside him. As Kley stopped outside the door to scrape mud from his shoes, Frank fired. Kley began to scream and pleaded with the boy not to shoot again, but with his gun reloaded, Frank continued toward the wounded man. Kley ran around a corner of the house and hid behind a rain barrel. He again begged the boy not to shoot, promising to give the keys or anything else. But Frank said he continued to advance. Then Pop leaped at me. I shot, but I missed him by at least 2 feet, and he took the gun. Then I ran. End of quote. End of article. Due to all the screaming and gunfire, a nearby neighbor, Clayton Gons, came hurrying over to investigate. He found the bullet-riddled body of Andrew Kley wedged between a rain barrel and a fence. He was still alive. Unfortunately, his wife Gertrude had perished from her wound. The local authorities were summoned and a posse formed as Andrew was taken to Missouri Baptist Hospital in critical condition. In the meantime, Frank managed to run to House Springs, a short distance from Cedar Hill, where he hid in the back of a tavern. On Tuesday morning, he was picked up on Highway 30 as he tried to board a bus headed to St. Louis and brought to the Hillsborough jail. Gertrude Kley's funeral and burial were held at the Glaze Creek Evangelical Church. One son, who was serving in the Army during World War II, and her husband, who was still in the hospital, were unable to attend. This kindly, slight woman who'd agreed to take in a troubled child was laid to rest without the benefit of her own loving family to say goodbye. That loss surely weighed heavily on them and the community for many years. Even so, the story of Frank Deford did not end here, and the trajectory of his life continued to spiral in ever-widening circles of missed opportunity and despair. Newspaper reports of the murder were quick to capitalize on the fascinating aspect of the angelic-faced child whose gangster-style speech and attitude were in stark contrast to his appearance. When questioned by Captain Thomas Whitecotton, the boy readily admitted the home he had with the Kleys was the best he had ever known. He told the story of the planning and execution of the shooting with no sign of deception or remorse. A photograph of the boy, who appeared much younger than his 13 years, featured the lad lighting up a cigarette in his jail cell as he recited the details of the crime. He admitted to the authorities that he had dreamed of becoming an auto mechanic and had hoped to continue his education. When tested for mental acuity, he showed that he was intelligent, yet immature. His tolerance for frustration was extremely low, and he had a lightning-quick temper. It should be noted that during his time in jail and throughout his trial, neither his mother, stepfather, nor natural father ever made an appearance. He had murdered a woman who had tried to be a mother to him because of his longing for a mother who had casually tossed him aside. Frank Deford was originally charged with first-degree murder, but the charge was changed to second-degree murder due to his young age. He was sentenced to 20 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. The story of the child killer was picked up in newspapers across the nation. The story soon came to the attention of Father Edward J. Flanagan in Nebraska, founder of the famous institution Boys Town. Boys Town became internationally known thanks to the movie of the same name, starring Spencer Tracy. Father Flanagan believed that prison was no place for young boys. His philosophy espoused that these children simply needed the structure and love they had lacked in their homes to give them a chance at a successful and honorable life. He petitioned Governor Donnelly of Missouri to parole Frank Deford into his care at the Nebraska facility in hopes of giving the boy an opportunity to turn his life around. Donnelly refused, stating that Missouri was not going to set the precedent of sending its youthful offenders out of state. There was some backlash from a few citizens who knew that this decision would be the last hope of rehabilitation for Frank, and they were right. In a letter written to Governor Donnelly by Captain Whitecotton, it was apparent the officer feared for the boy's safety while in his care. He admitted that he kept him out of the general prison population, gave him a saxophone and lessons in an effort to give him some form of recreation, and had a tutor to see to the boy's education. Interestingly, in the spring of 1946, Frank requested to be sent to the church farm, which would allow him to work in the open air, and he was granted that request. The letter recounts that Lawrence Deford learned of his son's whereabouts in that year and wrote the prison stating that he was remarried and living in California. He further indicated that he wanted Frank to live with him upon his release. On August 3, 1947, 16-year-old Frank managed to escape from the church farm in Jefferson City with another inmate named Raymond Glass. The boys hid in the wooded area near the prison farm until the following day when they hopped a train bound for St. Louis. After arriving on the outskirts of the city, they parted company. Frank hitchhiked to Springfield, Missouri, and worked for a time on a chicken farm. With the money he made, he bought a ticket to Tribune, Kansas, which was the furthest point away from Missouri his money could afford. He worked at a sandwich shop where the employer encouraged him to enroll in school. Unable to find a good excuse not to go, Frank agreed, but balked when he learned he'd have to be fingerprinted. When confronted by the employer as to why he would not register for school, Frank had to admit he might be arrested. He turned himself in without incident to the sheriff and returned to prison on January 31st, 1948. Things seemed to be working out reasonably well for Frank until 1957, when he was sent to Fulton State Asylum. Psychological evaluations labeled Frank as paranoid and a psychopath. This move infuriated him and caused him to attempt suicide. In a letter to O.G. Blackwell, Associate Warden of Alcatraz, Frank later wrote, quote, "God proved to me that I was not what I seemed to be. Instead of being a lowly convict, I was the savior of the world." End quote. He went on to say that he saw a vision of his mother and that God tortured her by cutting off her arms and legs to convince him that he had to sacrifice himself to save her and the rest of the world. In the letter found in his prison records, Frank claimed that he used fingernail clippers to clip a vein so that he would bleed to death, but was found lying unconscious and taken to the infirmary where they chained him to the bed. His attempts at suicide thwarted, Deford decided on a different course of action: escape. On September 2nd, 1957, Frank Deford, 26, James Fitch, 22, and Harold Hendrickson, 35, overpowered one of the attendants at the Fulton State Asylum No. 1 and escaped. For 10 days, the trio went on a spree of stealing cars and weapons as they made their way toward Minnesota, where Fitch claimed to have friends who could provide a hideout. The first car they stole was in Havana, Illinois. They were stopped in a second vehicle which was stolen in Michigan by 2 Minneapolis patrolmen. The convicts were able to disarm the policemen and stole the patrol car. 2 of the men, Fitch and Deford, were apprehended when they tried to steal another car on Flora Avenue the following day. One thing about Frank Deford, he never lied about his crimes. When questioned about the car thefts and firearms, he readily told the truth. He entered a plea of guilty at the criminal court in Minnesota and was sentenced to 5 years. At this point, he was sent to Leavenworth Prison in Kansas to continue to serve the term for the murder. However, on March 4, 1958, Frank was transferred to Alcatraz Prison in California for a quote-unquote safer custody. For the next 3 years, Frank's behavior became more and more violent and psychotic. Most of the offenses chronicled in his records at Alcatraz are for creating disturbances, fighting, and intimidation. His erratic behavior culminated in a bizarre incident where he pulled the stuffing from his mattress and set his cell on fire. In 1960, his natural mother, Mabel, moved to Los Angeles, California, with Frank Milne, whom she married. Somehow, Frank learned of her move and wrote a letter addressed, quote, "Dear Mom and Dad," end quote, a heartbreaking reminder that the boy, now a man, still longed for the love of his mother. The letter was light-hearted, and he expressed remorse at the choices he had made in his life. It is probable that, knowing she was in California, he hoped she would come to see him. Reports from the prison indicate no one ever did. Frank was set to be paroled from Alcatraz in 1961, but was due to be sent to Minnesota to serve the sentence for automobile theft and firearm possession he had received there. During his tenure at Alcatraz, Frank became known as a snitch or informant on the illegal activities of some of the inmates there. He was marked for death, which didn't appear to worry him. Guards reported overhearing prisoners threatening that if the inmates didn't get to Deford in Alcatraz, there were convicts at the Minnesota State Prison who would do the job. The document trail for Frank Raymond Deford ends abruptly with his death in the Minnesota Security Hospital on January 28, 1966. His death certificate claims he died of cardiac decompensation or congestive heart failure. He was buried at St. Michael's Cemetery in Bayport, Minnesota. He was 34, 20 years from the date of his original sentence for the murder of Gertrude Kley. In the years following Gertrude's death, Andrew Kley recovered from his brush with death. He married a widow, Mrs. Lulu Moss, who died in November 1966. Andrew died in 1977 at the age of 81. He is buried at the Burgess Cemetery in Jefferson County, Missouri. Special thanks must be given to Sheila Cruz, granddaughter of the late Mabel Anderson and niece of Frank R. Deford, for the valuable information she shared about this story. When asked about Mabel, who died in 1998, she said, quote, "Mabel was a very good grandmother, but a very bad mother," end quote. For more information on this and other podcasts of Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem, please follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, where there are links to resources, photographs, and documents used to construct the stories. For questions, comments, or suggestions for other historical subjects, please email Mindy Hudson at melindamalloo, MELINDAMALOO @gmail.com. Join us again next month for another episode of Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem.